This presentation is brought to you by the ZACK Foundation, a global philanthropic organization with a focus on poverty, education, human rights, mental health, and cultural exchange. In this series, we will explore the symposium lectures, in which we discuss principles of management, marketing, international business, and psychology. I hope you enjoy.
It's more expensive than the products that you bring. Products that are so I mean, they would make no monuments.
Don't forget, you guys, help yourself. Want some brownies from downstairs?
No, I'm so sorry. You go to broad to the muffins. I use some things at engineer.
I went to dinner, that's why I was late. I went to dinner.
Outside of Chicago. There's a Polish store outside the city. You wanna buy components and you should but anything. Oh yeah, no, yeah. I think they do like one time like for class. I think they also like a Polish store. They're like 5 years expensive as this year for launch one because you send everything from there. You're just yeah, and about $100 pay for that. Or you guys want to take midterm, one hand sandwich, one. Yeah. To go.
You don't feel like being Russian.
Yeah, basically.
And so yes, we're all saying forward.
Trade offers.
You want to be the against?
No, I'm for it. I'm for it. Yeah.
I guess it depends on the agreement. It's like a lot more because they don't have to like lower production. Yeah, like they don't have to compete with like other companies or like a company. Right.
I think that we have smaller companies between small wood, which is I believe like for against yeah. We're exporting more, but that would make it just say like increase competition, or also like you can start trading more different regardless of the
Yeah, that's instead of, yeah.
It would be different. So like the price would vary regardless.
That's the like small business. They like that just for resources that they don't anyone based on just like, yeah.
But if there's like some sort of export and import, but like if you're what are you gonna offer to any other country like ours?
Yeah, that's what it is. It's just,
Benefits that.
I mean,
What's that other one?
Yeah, I mean, the benefits outweigh
So then the next part is four.
That's okay. We're known for having people. That's basically all that happens.
Let's look it up.
That's so amazing. It's so
It's in
strange.
the-
It's so amazing. Like,
You guys need more time? A couple more minutes?
I can see why make it better for you.
I mean, it definitely depends on the country. But every single country has its own benefits to it. Kind of like that one where it's like I'll trade X amount of butter for X amount of butter.
Alright, we'll start going around. Group 1. What is free trade?
So we broke it into the three groups, the business, people, and government. For business, we said, free trade would be growth and, more money to be made.
Say growth and more money to be made?
Yeah. And then for people, we said, affect jobs.
What do you, affect jobs in what way?
Both ways, positive ways and, bad ways, negative ways.
And
For government, we said, there would be no tariffs.
so growth. So for government, what, they'll lose money, tariffs, taxes? Group 2, what you come up with? Free trade.
The definition of it, or just what's for the three things there?
Yeah, just in theory, but your
Okay,
theory.
so we said, companies can trade freely, people, companies, regardless of where they are, and then no tariffs slash quotas.
Mhm.
For companies, that would lower costs and increase production. For individuals, it would be, have cheaper goods and access to more products. And then for government, they would lose money and lose control over.
So free trade helps us to have more alternatives, more products available for consumers to choose by, therefore it may help more consumption or some sense. You're saying it lowers costs,
Yeah.
lowers cost of production? In what way?
For companies, I mean, if you don't have to pay tariffs or like some quotas on things,
Yeah.
then you can just save that money,
Mhm.
even though consumers do sometimes pay for that. It's not direct in the business. And then also like you can pick and choose where you wanna trade if there's no limitations.
More markets, right?
Yeah.
So you got access to more markets. Group 3. Guys,
We said it's when citizens of a country are allowed to trade with other citizens from another country without regulations, tariffs, and penalties from their home country.
Did you guys break it up into like what it would do for either the government,
Not really, we just.
the company, just kind of gave an overview. Do you guys wanna add anything? Just
Oh, yeah, I mean, I agree, I agree that there'd be a lot more markets. That's the biggest one, I don't know. Definitely more markets, lower prices.
Group 4, free trade?
We said it's the ability to trade without government intervention like tariffs, and extra taxes, and then we kind of broke it down into organizations, individuals, and then nations. So for organizations, we said that they have a lot more opportunities to expand into new markets. Like they could kind of work on trading internationally and expanding their business. For individuals, we said that they'd have more freedom to choose where to purchase without having to worry about like extra taxes. A lot of government intervention there. And then for nations, we kind of broke it down into smaller and bigger nations. So for those smaller and underdeveloped nations, they're given a chance to really grow and be able to trade and kind of sell what they're good at making. And then for bigger nations, they have opportunities to get rare supplies or things that they don't produce well, or that are cheaper to get somewhere else. So overall, like, nations in general can just benefit because it's a chance to grow.
More opportunities, right? Pretty much more opportunities for everybody, right? The individual has more choice, the organization is able to have freer markets to go into, more alternatives, and then nations, if they're underdeveloped, they have more nations to sell to, right? Which helps them. So who's all for, it's kind of hard to say, right? Because there's really nowhere on earth that has ultimate free trade, right? Where just, people just blindly sell without any government intervention. The government has to make money somehow, right? But who's for more free trade and who's for less free trade? Who's for more free trade first? Why are you for more free trade?
I just think that it works. I think that it helps out businesses, you know, in a way. I think it just all around works for everybody except for the government. And I think that sometimes the government needs to stay out of some of the situations and some of the trade agreements.
Yeah. So it's kind of like just having free trade here, right?
Yeah.
In the United States, where we just want to trade with everybody in every kind of sector or market or whatever, right? We don't want the government having too many regulations on us or increasing the taxes. You're saying it's kind of a win-win.
Yeah, I mean,
Economic theory.
one of the examples I can give is like there's a certain car that's not allowed here in the U.S. And it's only allowed after it's 10 or 12 years old, but it's a car that you can drive it in Canada and it's perfectly fine. And they
Which
put
car is
there-
it?
It's the R34
Who's the manufacturer?
Nissan.
And why is it?
It's because it's a left-hand drive.
Oh, it's a left.
So it has to be certain cars that are left-hand drive to be so many years old.
Will they allow it? They modified it to right?
Yeah, if it's modified to the right, they still have to wait. So like that's one of the examples that I think of when it comes to like free trade, just trading agreements.
Okay. That was good. Anything you want to add?
I mean, just more higher quality products with less price, lower price. Keeping
So
price-
increased competition is always better, because it allows a lot of people to create the best of what they want to create, right? Who wins? Hopefully the consumer wins. And since there's such a high supply of this stuff, that means that, we get it at a cheaper price, right? So it's a win-win for the consumer. That's what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. Who else is for it? Yes.
Oh, no, I was gonna say, I don't know, like, I wouldn't know if I would be for it or against, because I don't know, like in the middle, I think like a little bit of government intervention, a little bit of like tariffs, duties and stuff like that, but like, maybe not too much. I don't know, I think like, if we're not like, if they're not like, taxing or putting these tariffs on like these, I don't know, on these trade transactions, I guess, like, you know, like, the government wouldn't be making as much money. And I mean, like, there's so many, like, services that the government does, like construction, and like, you know, like police, firefighters, and stuff like that. And I guess, like, that would be detrimental to them in a way as well. And that's something else you really have to think about.
That's how you feel? I mean, that's your stance on it?
Well, I mean, it's not necessarily my
I
stance.
mean, do you think
so,
the
like,
government should have more money? If you think they should have more money, should they have less money? And everything, you know, if they have less,
I mean,
that means more privatization. Does privatization
Yeah.
equal better quality stuff? Or does public money equal better quality stuff? Is a private police force better than a public police force?
so private, is that like basically like talking about like governments or like?
Well,
or
no,
like,
private would mean organizations. That means that people who started organizations
Yeah.
or assembled together and did something without the government saying, hey, we're creating
so
this
that's-
with your
so that's
tax money.
private. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
Take some time to think about it.
Yeah.
Who's next? Anybody hit their hand up? What are you guys? 4?
We disagree. Some of us are for, some of us are against.
Okay. Well, those of you who are 4, yes.
I'm more for it. Just cause like, I think it gives like countries the opportunity to experience things from different countries, like more globalization really.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, if you say as a whole, maybe as a whole, on a macro level, there's a greater benefit of culture, right? Sharing the products that probably we wouldn't have access to, right? Because it goes beyond products and services, it goes beyond to even art, you know? Are there restrictions on entertainment? What if you couldn't watch certain shows on Netflix because they're produced somewhere that your government says, now, we don't want to show that. We just want only stuff produced here. Artwork, right? Music. Can't listen to that. Can't be sold here in the United States. Yes.
I initially was leaning towards being for it, but now I'm kind of against it in a way. Like, it's good for it because it would spark international trade and the economy would be booming, but against it, like, I'm kind of as cruel as it may sound, I'm kind of a self-interested person. So it may be beneficial to our domestic economy because it would spark business, domestic business, and we would, you know, our economy would be more beneficial opposed to a country abroad.
That's right. So theoretically, right? Remember, I think last class, a lot of you guys missed class, but last class we talked about what's your economic stance, right? You're liberal, you're conservative, economic. Government intervention in your economics or no? Or completely free trade? Some people say middle, right? A little bit of government. Here you go, General Motors. You're about to fail. You're about to go bankrupt, General Motors. If you fail, we think the economy, our national economy is going to be horrible. Here's $400 billion of taxpayer money to keep you going. Somebody's like, heck no. They failed, they didn't compete, right? They lost. I want to give them money, right? So you have to take a stance at some point. You're like, hey, this is not what I'm about, you know? But now we're saying on a global scale, free trade, meaning everybody do what they want to do, sell financial transactions, no SEC regulation, start a hedge fund somewhere, nobody's monitoring you, nobody cares what you do. I'm gonna take all of Dominicans' money, I'm gonna invest it overseas in this stuff. The SEC is not gonna watch what I'm doing, right? I'm not gonna have to fill out tons of paperwork and quarterly reports. But I may be corrupt, because I'm a human being, right? Maybe a lot of people involved that are corrupt. So if that's just what we're looking at here in the United States, and we say, what are we looking at on a global scale, right? Want to do business with China. Okay, you're in the business to sell a particular product to, you're competing with China, right? You guys sell the same product, same exact product. Free market, free open trade. China's government gives that company a crap load of money as a government subsidy lowered the price of it. Now everybody in 170 countries gonna buy it like it's Walmart. And you, in the United States, will go out of business. People are corrupt. We say individuals are corrupt. Corporations can become corrupt. Governments can become corrupt. So maybe, kind of always look at it like a threefold. Like, okay, what's going to happen to the individual? What'll happen to the organization? The government, right? So, I mean, it's a lot of scales being balanced. You were going to say something else? Were you going to?
No.
No? Okay. Who else is for? Want to add something to it? Yes.
I mean, we all kind of agreed that we were for, and we all kind of said the same reasons, that it allows everything to kind of grow and get better, like an economy can grow and get better, relationships between countries can get better through trade.
Mhm.
He also said like that culture can be enhanced because you are being able to experience like different cultures when you trade.
Cultural exchange, right? Because you exchange culture too. Every time you buy something that's not American culture, you're buying something foreign. And people are intrigued by each other's cultures. You go to Japan, they love our music, they got rappers, they got, all type of stuff. They've imported our culture. Here we're like, oh, I want a BMW, why? I only trust German engineering, whatever the case may be, right? You're like, oh, I like, that culture does that the best, that's what I'm about. Or you want a Ferrari, you want Italian, whatever the case may be. Against, anybody? Yeah.
Two reasons. The first one is I feel like whatever we save as consumers and the fact that things will be cheaper, we just give back to the government because they would have to impose higher taxes for us. The amount of money that goes to education, public, like highways, everything like that, that's where they're getting their money from, a lot of it. So they would have to find a way to patch up that hole if that was gone for them, the profit from tariffs and stuff like that. And the second way I thought about it is I actually disagree about the growth, because if you assign like a project that was worth 100% of our grade and created the groups for us, which is basically what happens if like countries have trade agreements and tariffs and stuff like that. You create little groups of where the trade happens, then you have pretty equal groups. You chose them for us. It's not like everyone got together and just the smart people went there. The second you say choose your members, and this was like 100% of our grade, everyone would want to be with the smartest person.
Yeah.
You wouldn't go to the person that's struggling. You just leave them in the corner, work on your own. Everyone wants to be on that one side where there's growth. So I feel like the countries in the middle that can't be as competitive as China would just completely go out of the economy, because they would have no agreements with anybody, because no one wants to go there. It'd just be like the big names trading.
That's a good point. Yeah, I remember you said that like 2 classes ago when we talked about education. You was like, hey, I worked hard. The next guy didn't work hard enough. Too bad. I'm in this position because of my merit, my hard work, my studying, right? So now you've kind of taken a different stance, because you're saying social welfare is important and public works is important, right? Because who is going to build the 290? Who's going to build 94? Who's going to build a new McCormick place? The government's going to do that, right? And the government needs money because the government is a corporation. It says incorporated, Chicago incorporated, 18 blah, 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 blah. It sells bonds, right? Which means that an investor could buy those bonds, meaning that the city owed them money and need to pay that money at this date. It is a corporation. Government's a corporation, right? Treasury notes, federal government sells it, you can buy it. Go online, buy a treasury note. Gives you a guaranteed rate. Yeah, they're gonna always pay you. They got an endless amount of money, right? You're gonna get that money. Some other company may go bankrupt, you're not gonna get the money. You're screwed. So government is important. It serves a lot of functions, and it is an organization. It is a corporation. It invests. It does all these different things. So you do have a point, right? It helps. Who takes a 290? Not the richest people. Anybody who got a car, right? Who takes the CTA? Anybody who got the fare. It's public, open to the public. If it's private, no, can't go on this. This is our little group. Can't do that. You're not invited. Yes?
I was just thinking of it a different way, like, because have like a lot of stuff going on right now and
Yeah.
there's hyperinflation and the US has a lot of tariffs with them. And that's for good reason, because do you really want to be doing business with a country that's struggling financially, that would probably be like abusing your nation, you know, to get more goods and for you not to get anything back out of it? And if that country's corrupt, you kind of have a bad image. If other countries look at you and like, oh, the US is doing business with that nation, is that really the best image you want the US to have? So in many ways, it's important to have tariffs to discourage that kind of trade.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, do you want to be doing trade with countries that violate significant human rights? With countries that have genocide? With countries that go on live leak and they're beheading 10,000 people? They have 50,000 people enslaved, like literally enslaved, like the case in Libya now, in Tunisia. Like literal slave, like not a joke. People in chains. You say no. You're like, hey, we have tariffs, we have sanctions, we have whatever the case may be, because this type of stuff, this is like an organization. Your reputation's on the line, right? Your branding's on the line. Who you do business with is on the line. You know, fire, what's his name? He got caught in a sex scandal. We didn't get nothing to do with it. You're done. Your contract's up, right? Because that's going to impact business. That's how governments think too, like a business that can impact. When I was in Peru, there were like thousands upon thousands of Venezuelan immigrants there trying to work, and it's just crazy the corruption that we're talking about going on with the government. I think half of Parliament there got locked up in prison and stuff. So, and not that Peru's president was in prison too. So corruption is everywhere. Yes, someone's gonna say something. Okay. Against. Anybody else want to add? Does it create or does it take away jobs? We just gave the example to be like, if a country can somehow create a way to sell that product for cheaper, that will ultimately affect the entire market of a certain industry, which means that industry, if there's global international trade, will fail in that particular country. And that can mean hundreds of thousands of jobs that loss. Why? Because we open floodgates to free trade. Let's say even at that point we say, okay, well we strategize. We have 400 million people to worry about here. Maybe we have restrictions on certain countries that produce certain products at very low cost, and we have a competing product here. Would that be more like a strategy, like a CEO? I mean, essentially that's what your congressman or senator or president is. Trying to strategize, balance, right? And also just keeping people happy. All right, the point of this is try to just understand the fundamental underbelly of what the heck it means when we're talking free trade and policy. So that's just not some foreign, concept we're constantly thinking of, right? Because it can be applied a gazillion ways. Any questions? So as you guys said, free trade occurs when governments do not attempt to restrict what citizens can buy in another country or what they can sell to another country. We have the, yes?
Question, so if free trade would could happen, maybe like 100% out there, would we be able to trade things that are considered now illegal? Because restrict what citizens can buy and what they can sell. So if one country sells something that is illegal in America, the government cannot restrict it. Can you technically buy it from them and sell it to them if it's legal there? So,
you're saying the legal aspect?
Yeah.
You're saying, no, I mean, obviously we had complete free trade. You can do what you want to do, right? because policy is law, right? You would say the law would shift if there's free trade, right? And that's why even when you study the field of economics, it's generally coined together with political economics, right? Economics only exists due to the policies and regulations within that framework, you know? So if it was free trade, then you say, hey, there's no law, you know? Arms dealer, sure. I'd be the first one right there. I'd be selling AR-15s, AK-47s. That's against the law. You can't do that, right? Can't do that. So even in this slide, we talk about the interest of national security. If there is free trade for many things, you think of what does that do for national security? If we're talking arms, if we're talking military-grade weapons, this means other people in other countries will have your intellectual property. They will have your advancements in technology. That's not even out in the market. It can't be sold to the public, right? The military has significant technological advantages over what you see on eBay, over what you see in Amazon, over your Apple phone, over Samsung. They have things that are 10 years down the road, you know? And you don't want to have other countries having access to that because that means you will no longer be able to fly on a commercial plane. Somebody have a phone that can take it down. Do you want to live in that world? No. So obviously it is a delicate balance when you're thinking of stuff like that, right? You don't want to have free trade depending on a certain market, right? Military market, certain product, certain thing. So as it is with our economy, our national economy, we have the Keynesian model, which is small government intervention. I don't even want to say small. We have government intervention and free market trade, right? And that's not in the Constitution. Free market trade is not in the Constitution. Else we would have it, like complete, you know? It could be in an amendment somewhere. So these are just constantly argued by Democrats and Republicans. So we talked about tariffs, which is government intervention in markets. It's just taxes levied on imports that effectively raise the cost of imported products relative to domestic products. So obviously, if you raise the cost from somewhere else, a product coming in from somewhere else, no one's going to want to buy that, right? So you're just inducing your own people to buy something that's here, right? To stimulate your economy that way. Which could be seen kind of like a protectionist or a nationalistic perspective. There's specific tariffs, fixed charge for each unit of a good import, which deals with like quotas, and Valorum tariffs levied as a proportion of the value of imported goods. So it's just, you know, you're creating tariffs for a certain amount of things, right? And if you go beyond that certain amount, then the tariffs go higher. What is the point of tariffs? They help increase government revenues. They force, like we say, everything is about kind of forcing people to behave a certain way. Force consumers to pay more for certain imports. They're pro-producer, meaning that you're trying to aid the manufacturer in your particular country to come out better than their competitors around the world. And they're anti-consumer. Like we said before, with very low tariffs or no tariffs at all, we would have a gazillion more choices, right? To buy whatever it is we want, a particular thing. They also reduce the overall efficiency of the world economy. So we're speaking from a macro, global economic perspective, we would say that it's not being particularly efficient because there's too many the intervention doesn't allow for competition, true competition, right? People to compete, make choices, decisions, things like that. Subsidies, which we receive here in our education, if you got Stafford loans, right? Subsidized, is that subsidized, unsubsidized? Subsidized would mean that the government help pay for it, right? Government payments to domestic producers, subsidies help domestic producers, and they compete against low-cost foreign importers. And there's different ways to have subsidies, right? You can either create low interest on loans. That's a way to fuel things. You could either just, give people money through grants. The government gives grants, right? That's why you may have a grant for school or something like that. Or you could change different things, like we said, changing quotas on things. You have to pay this much tax on this amount of stuff, et cetera, et cetera. But consumers typically absorb the cost of subsidies. So once again, taxpayers typically absorb that money. So. Import quotas restrict the quantity of some good that may be imported into a country. So like we said, there's quotas, right? A hybrid of a quota and a tariff, where a lower tariff is applied to imports within the quota than to those over the quota. And the quota rent, the extra profit that producers make when supply is artificially limited by an import quota. So once again, you're controlling supply, which will control demand, which will effectively control costs, revenues, and profits. We'll watch a quick TED Talk on international trade policy, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll go quickly over the midterm.
I want you all to come away from the next 10 minutes with a single counterintuitive idea.
Hey, we watched
And that-
this before, right? About trade deals? All right, well, keep on until I remember if we did it.
That is that trade deals aren't really about trade. Not in any conventional sense of the word. They're not about tariffs, they're not about quotas, they're not about GDP growth, they're not even really about jobs. That's how we tend to talk about it, job loss and job gain, and that's what's in the news, and that's what's at the DNC, but that's not what they're really about. Not really. And we'll get to that. But for now, I want to start at the very beginning. The modern era of free trade, as we think of it today, started in about 1944. When all the great lights of liberal economics got together in a little place called Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. And at the time, the world was in a pretty dark place. It was, all the people there remembered World War I, they lived through the Depression, World War II was still raging across the Atlantic, and at the top of everyone's mind at the time was world peace. How do we create an economy that fosters and necessitates world peace? That was the entire idea. And they seized on this idea of economic interdependence. The idea was that if nation states were dependent on each other for their supply chains, then they couldn't go to war with each other. If Germany needed France for its coal and France needed Germany for its steel, then they couldn't go to war with each other. So that was the idea behind what became, about 4 years later, the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And this little document created the world as we know it today. It created globalization, it created outsourcing, it created multinational corporation as we think of it. It's hard to imagine a world in which there weren't, McDonald's and global corporations and the sort of structure that we have now. But the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade is what did it. We created this. And it brought on this period of extraordinary disruption and convulsion and prosperity. from about 1948, when the GATT was first signed, to the late 70s, the global GDP grew by about 7% per year, just explosive growth. And for a while, people thought that wouldn't end. That was just it, we had cracked the code. But then it began to wane. In the late 70s and early 80s, you had the great lights of a new generation of liberal economics get together for a second time. A new Bretton Woods, only this time it was the Uruguay round, and it lasted for 8 years. And the scenario there was a little different. Instead of world peace and economic interdependence, they were really motivated by this idea of global efficiency. It's basically, how do we continue to boost the global economy as it has been boosted over the last 30 years? What do we do? And the scenario was different. So in the 1940s, there were just really, really high tariffs and quotas and really high or really protectionist policies at all the borders. And so lowering those could have this profound influence. But by the 80s, a lot of those quotas were pretty low. A lot of those tariffs were already pretty low. So they began to think outside the box, and they seized on this idea of non-tariff barriers. And now this leads into the modern era of trade I'm talking about now. Now, non-tariff barriers are the idea that it doesn't really matter how low a tariff is around a country's border. If once a product gets inside, it has to compete on an uneven playing field. So once you have, Jim Beam, for example, it doesn't matter if Japan doesn't have a tariff on liquor. If once it's inside Japan, it has to compete on the same shelf next to a Japanese liquor that's subsidized by the Japanese government. So the idea now was, we need to strip away all that other stuff and make the world economy as efficient as possible. And that is the philosophy that governed trade beginning in the 1990s. In 1995, we got rid of the GATT and we replaced it with something you probably have heard of, the World Trade Organization. And around that time, before and after, we had these extraordinarily, enormously powerful trade agreements, the NAFTA, the CAFTA, and literally thousands of bilateral investment treaties, all of which were governed by the same philosophy. Non-tariff barriers. How do you create, or you got nation states to sign on to this idea that their domestic industrial policies, their domestic laws, their domestic regulations needed to align with this global sense of efficiency. It's the whole idea. And that, just take a moment and appreciate that, because it's totally different than anything that the granddaddies of trade would have considered trade. In the late 19th century, David Ricardo and Adam Smith and all these people you learn about in the textbooks, when they were talking about trade, they were not talking about someone's domestic policy on environmental law. They were not talking about, how long a pharmaceutical company's data exclusivity should last. Should it last for 12 years or 7 years or 5 years, and under what circumstances? All of a sudden, that became what we were talking about when we talked about trade. And that changed everything. So to give you 2 examples, one of the biggest discussions about trade that we've been having since the late 90s involves the Europeans and the Americans. And the Americans want to export their genetically modified beef to Europe, and the Europeans, for a variety of sort of cultural and social mores, don't want GMO beef. And so you have this fight, because the Europeans say that they are allowed, for local rule and national sovereignty and democratic nations reflecting the preferences of their constituencies, they should be allowed to have those rules. And the US, it's backed by the WTO, says nope. Your domestic policies are not aligning with this sense of global efficiency. And that is actually a much more interesting discussion to be having than is trade good or is trade bad. Suddenly we're discussing national sovereignty, we're discussing local rule, we're discussing what do we mean by environmental regulations, and are we okay with them being trumped? Under what circumstances? So here's a second example, and this happened this year in the US. In the US, it used to be, or it is, that if you wanted to put your tuna on the shelf and say dolphin-free tuna on it, It actually, you had to use methods that actually excluded dolphins. And the Mexican government got wind of that and said, you know, that's not fair. That discriminates against Mexican fishermen. Because Mexican fishermen fish in waters that are dolphin heavy, and they use methods that don't exclude dolphins. So by having this law, we're actually discriminating against Mexican fishermen. And the WTO agreed. So we have, you know, these efficiency problems. You know, how do we think about global efficiency? How do we promote the free movement of as much goods and as much services across as many borders as possible, while at the same time preserving the laws and regulations that prize things that aren't about global efficiency, that are maybe about, you know, racial equality, or about protecting the environment, or laws that prize public health issues, things like that. That gets us up to where we are today. You may have noticed that the conversation that we're having about trade on the national stage right now is very confused. We've got both of our presidential candidates who appear to be in favor of free trade but are against the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That's that massive trade deal that would connect the United States and 11 other Pacific Rim countries. And then you have other organizations like the AARP and the Sierra Club and Doctors Without Borders that are opposed to elements of it. And people are telling us, you know, oh, you're either for free trade or you're against it. Or you're for globalization or you're against it. You know, what kind of world do you want to live in? Well, we're not talking about trade. We're talking about rules. We're talking about global rules, global standards, and what kind of world we want that to be. And as soon as you sort of change your mind and you realize that that's what we're talking about, it all starts to make a lot more sense. So I want to leave you guys with that idea. We created the world that we live in now. Our forefathers got together at Bretton Woods and they created this global economy that we have now. And we remade it in the late 80s and the 90s with the World Trade Organization. The rules that we pass and that we embrace are the rules of the game that we live in. So let's think about that. Let's think about trade in that context. Let's think about what rules we want to embrace, what we want them to serve. You know, do we want global efficiency to be the paradigm that we think of, or do we want it to be something else, maybe like global prosperity? Global prosperity for normal people, for farmers and ranchers and you know, everyday Americans. It's because the rules that we pass are the rules of the game. And when we talk about trade, we're talking about rules. Thank you so much.
It was a good video. Any thoughts on what she said, what she was talking about? Any disagreements, any agreements? Yes.
I mean, she definitely makes a good point. Like, without rules, there wouldn't be trade at all. Like, it's hard for people to trade correctly or like in a way that's beneficial to everyone without there being any rules in place.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's just a major problem now that we have, you know, globalization. You know, it's like, how do we keep our own rules? And we just, you know, open up the floodgates. And there's more people becoming competitors. You know, third world nation, I don't even think that's used in any textbooks. And everything's like a developing country, right? Because no country's that poor relative to what poor was 20 years ago, you know? So just something to think about in terms of, you know, where you stand on all of this. Like, you know, what are your thoughts? At some point, you guys will be involved when you own property, when you own a business. You're gonna care about this stuff because it's gonna impact you. It's gonna impact your family. You're gonna say, hey, where do I set the line? Where's my line in the sand? Is it what? Or there is no line. So, I mean, if you're able to conceptualize that, I think you could kind of get a grasp on what everything you'll read about in the news are here. You know, trade policy, this, and that. You're like, oh, I get it. Tap on that, you know. We'll take a 10-minute break, come back at 7:55, we'll take 5 minutes to just briefly go over the exam, and then we'll have 90 minutes for the exam. All right, everyone, the midterm should be pretty straightforward. There's 5 discussion questions. What I'm looking for is just briefly stating the concept. You know, you don't have to be verbatim. You don't have to give a concise definition, but you can put it in your own words. Just some sort of comprehension about what's being asked, and a good example. You know, your example. You know, obviously, you could look up different things, but put it in your own words. So what I'm looking for is independent thought in the answers. You know, not textbook answers. Apply it to the real world. Apply it to what you know, what you've read, things like that. Things you've talked about in discussion and things in the lecture. So on the exam, just at the top, you will see blank space for name. Just hand write out your name, and then when you're done, just bring this sheet back up to me when you're done. There's a section on Canvas for the midterm, so if you're going to do it electronically, you can just type out a Word document or PDF and upload it directly to Canvas. And that expires at 9:30. So however you want to do it, Canvas, email, or hand write it out, it's up to you. But just give me back these sheets with your name on it when you're done. Just let me know if you got any issues or concerns or questions. Come on.
This presentation was brought to you by the ZACK Foundation, a global philanthropic organization focusing on poverty, education, and mental health. We hope you've enjoyed.